the challenge with government borrowing and the challenge with any debt is that in order to get continued growth, you have to accelerate the debt. And so
Right.
I think part of the challenge was that we shifted from a lower deficit to a higher deficit in order to cushion the effects of COVID. That policy was likely prudent at the time,
No doubt.
given the deleveraging and disinflationary effects that existed from COVID, and we would have had a pretty bad outcome had it not happened. I think that the challenge and part of the liquidity provision by the central bank through money printing then helped cushion the effect of that high borrowing on asset prices because they wouldn't have to crowd out other asset prices. That was an important bridge, let's say, from where we were to where we are today. And what happened subsequent to that bridge occurring is that we started to get income growth that has been the primary driver of the expansion over the last, say, three and a half years. The deficit peaked in mid 2021. I think the challenge is that we sort of kept the deficit as it is. Such a large deficit, because it's stable, hasn't actually improved growth conditions. It's just supported the same level of GDP. And I think the challenge is when we got that sort of growth acceleration that was predominantly income driven, that was an opportunity to sort of scale back the fiscal, right?
Yeah.
And to sort of ease off the fiscal. It would have been particularly valuable as inflation was too high. Because a little fiscal constraint actually would have been the most effective way to slow inflation quickly. And the problem is that, we basically kept these deficits in place, these recession-like deficits in place at a time when we probably could have scaled it back and put ourselves in a better fiscal position to respond to the next downturn. But instead, we basically ran the economy hot, ran nominal GDP too hot, and haven't really resolved the fiscal problem. So it's not driving the growth, but we haven't taken the opportunity to reduce our reliance on the level of the deficit to support the level of the economy.
So it's a danger, but based on your words, I'm hearing you think it is a mild yet growing danger, whereas I think it's a medium and growing danger.
Yeah, I think what do we mean by danger? Like I think
a currency crisis. A crisis is always such a hyperbolic word. A currency mess.
Yeah, I think I think the question is always the big question, as I said, is, we have too much debt relative to our income producing capacity, and we got to reduce the value of money over time. And that'll happen a bunch of different ways. More likely than not, it's not going to be a crisis. And the reason why it's not going to be a crisis is that when you have the debt in your own currency, the Fed can always print money and fund the Treasury if there's, at interest rates that are palatable to the economy. And I think Japan is a good example of how that can play out, which is that, for 30 years, Japan has run very large deficits, printed a lot of money, and, helped contain that. And while the currency has fallen, it hasn't been a crisis. I don't think anyone, if you were on the streets of Tokyo and you didn't really look at, currency or really think about that, you certainly wouldn't say crisis. I mean, inflation was zero essentially for 20, 30 years, right? So it didn't feel like a currency crisis because the debt was denominated in their own currency and the central bank didn't print too much to overinflate the economy. If anything, they printed too little. And so my guess is we'll see something like that, which is that, if the deficits are too large and interest rates start creeping up relative to what is appropriate given the domestic economic conditions, the Fed will come in and print money and help contain the magnitude of those interest rates. The real question is whether they do too much. And that's challenging. Like Japan did too little for a long time. It's certainly easy to do too much in those circumstances.